doesn't know me. I'm trying to be at an angle where my face won't look like features painted on a balloon. I guess we're all adjusting to new technology. I'm really grateful to Amy for being willing to give her presentation, which was scheduled to be our docent enrichment at our last March meeting, which was canceled. And as Sandra said, hopefully we'll have more of these in the coming days. Amy Lutz is a graduate student at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She will graduate in August 2020 with a master's degree in history after defending her thesis. More significantly, she has been a docent at the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center for the last 2 years. About 15 years ago, she saw a paragraph about Karl Lutz in a textbook, and because of name recognition, became interested and has been pursuing research about him ever since, and will continue to research this important subject. Amy does freelance social media and communications work. I'll be walking around the Central West End, hoping to run into her walking her dog Kyla. She's also spending this time playing the piano. She's classically trained. So again, as Sandra said, there will be questions at the conclusion. If everyone will mute, I'm happy to introduce Amy Lutz. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. If everyone will bear with me for 2 seconds, I'm going to screen share my presentation here. If you all have trouble seeing it, shouldn't, but please do let me know. Hopefully that holds it up there. My internet is running slowly, but it should start. Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. It sounds like a couple people are not on mute, and I will just keep talking through it, but please mute your microphones, because it is, I will start, my head will start moving back and forth listening to it. Anyway, on a more important note, I'm really excited to be giving this presentation today in my kitchen during quarantine, because today is a really important day for this particular type of history. Today happens to be the 125th anniversary of Karl Lutz's birth. He was actually born in Switzerland on March 30th, 1895. He actually died 45 years ago back in February, so there's a lot of important anniversaries this year when it comes to Karl Lutz. Now, I know some of you on the call are somewhat familiar with who he is, but just broadly speaking, Karl Lutz is considered righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem. He is a Holocaust rescuer, meaning he took action to save a very large number of Jews during the Holocaust, and I'll tell you the number at the end if you haven't heard it. But sadly, as the title of my presentation implies, there's not a lot of research on Karl Lutz. It's part of the reason why I feel it's important for me to do it, because there's only been a few scholars who have really taken time to do the research on Lutz. And perhaps more importantly, for those of you who are on the call, which I think is probably a good number of you who are from the St. Louis area, Karl Lutz used to be a member of our community. He used to consider himself a St. Louisian. And so this slide you're looking at right here, hopefully you can see it. I know the camera's kind of cutting it off a little bit, but I included this kind of timeline for a couple different reasons. First, because I want to give you all an idea of where I'm going today with this presentation, so you can kind of have a roadmap, but also because I know there's at least a handful of docents and staff members of the museum on this call who may have the opportunity to tell this story. And so I wanted to give you an idea of how I tell the story, usually in an abbreviated format, because you all are getting a much longer version of it than I would normally give when I'm on tours. And so these are the bullet points that I usually try to hit. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Lutz's story, these probably won't mean too much to you right now, but we'll knit it all together by the end. So we'll start talking about his St. Louis connections, his time here within the local region and within Missouri more broadly. Before Lutz went to Budapest, Palestine, or excuse me, Budapest, Hungary, where he enacted this rescue effort, he actually had a diplomatic appointment in Palestine, which was a British mandate at the time. Of course, as many of you know, the state of Israel had not yet been officially founded and recognized, not until the late 1940s. And so Palestine was basically just part of the greater British Empire. And his appointment there is necessary to understand, to know what he later does in Budapest. So of course, we'll talk about his actual rescue efforts, the protective papers that he issued, his participation in what was called the International Ghetto, which I will explain here in a few slides, and then of course, many occasions where he stepped in to rescue individual people. And then we'll wrap up talking about what happened when he went back to Switzerland, how his colleagues and his superiors and his nation more generally responded to his rescue effort. And then we'll talk about some of the honors, and I will reveal exactly how many people he's rescued if you're unfamiliar. Most of the photos in this presentation, I feel like I should say, are from the United States Holocaust Museum. About half of them are pictures I've taken myself, actually, and I'll specify those when we get there. One of those is on the next slide. But let's start with Carl Lutz's time in the United States. He actually spends about 20 years here, a little over 20 years. At the age of 18 in 1913, he immigrates to the United States, not knowing a word of English, and ends up working in a factory in Granite City, Illinois, right across the river for about 5 years, basically just saving up money for school. Carl Lutz was also a pacifist, and so in between, it was either 1917 or 1918, and the research is a little unclear, he spends a number of months avoiding the draft. He actually travels around the country trying to avoid having to register. He eventually gets, caught up with, so to speak, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he does register for the draft, but he's not drafted. And so shortly after the war, he enters school at Central Wesleyan College. Now, Central Wesleyan College closed in 1941, but again, for those of you in the local area, I'm in downtown St. Louis right now, and it's probably an hour and 15 minutes for me. It's off exit 193. Off I-70, that's where the campus used to be. Now, most of the campus is gone, but there is a Methodist church that is still on the campus that was there at the time. And like I said, I have a photo of that on the next slide. And Carl Lutz, in his case, Carl Lutz was a devout Christian. This plays into his rescue effort later, and his faith was something that was very important to him very early in his life. And so while he was at Central Wesleyan College, he actually intended on going into ministry or missionary work. He wanted to be a pastor of some sort, but unfortunately realizes pretty quickly that he's a terrible public speaker. He's got stage fright. He's also a perfectionist, so he was never satisfied with any kind of address that he ever gave. And personality-wise, he was not someone who often sought the spotlight. He could be shy, he could be soft-spoken. He was very professional and very well-spoken, but was not someone you'd see kind of in the middle of a room and in the spotlight. And so because of all of those reasons, he realizes that giving sermons to large groups of people as a missionary or as a pastor, not something that's going to happen for him. And so he ends up going into the diplomatic service. He actually transfers to George Washington University and graduates from there in 1924. He spends a number of years, about 6 years, in Washington, D.C., working in a job there, and then travels around the country to different diplomatic appointments. He spends about 6 weeks in New York City. He hates the crowds, gets claustrophobic on the subway, sends letters back to Switzerland demanding that he be moved somewhere else. This is actually a constant theme throughout Lutz's time in the United States. He's constantly sending letters back to his superiors saying, "This time in the United States is hard on my health, please let me come home." Fortunately, until he's sent to Palestine, the answer was always no. And so after he's in New York, he actually spends a few years in Philadelphia. And then his final appointment is in downtown St. Louis in 1933 and 1934. We'll hop back a little bit for those of you guys watching on Zoom. This is a photo that I took myself, you can tell based on how bright it is. This is a sign that is outside that Methodist church that is still where the campus used to be on Central Wesleyan College's campus. And there's actually still a sign outside the church that says Central Wesleyan College, 1871. And the college was founded in actually in 1861, but I assume this was just dedicated in 71. So that is still there, so far as I know. I took this photo about 1.5 years ago. So we'll flash forward a little bit to Carl Lutz's time in St. Louis. So this is another photo that I took myself. Up in the right corner there, you'll see 411 North 7th Street. Now, I did not grow up in St. Louis myself, but those of you who did might be familiar with the old Ambassador Theater. It used to be on that block. It was a 6-story theater with office buildings above it. It was actually demolished in 1996, and this plaza and building replaced it. I took this at a stoplight, if you can't tell. But that building, before it was demolished in 1996, was actually where Lutz worked when he worked in downtown St. Louis. And he lived for a short period of time, at least, in the old Statler Hotel, which is now the Marriott St. Louis Grand off of Washington Avenue, which is just right around the corner from where this is. And Lutz made a lot of connections to the local area. You see one example here on Zoom on the left. There was an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on March 18th, 1934, entitled "Chancellor of Swiss Consulate to Wed." And that was Karl Lutz. He actually met his wife here. His wife, Gertrude, or Trudy, was another Swiss immigrant who happened to be living here in St. Louis with her family at the time. She, at the time, was living at 3730 Lindell Boulevard. Those of you who are familiar with the Midtown area would know that that is actually on St. Louis University's campus. I actually walked there yesterday from my apartment, so that gives you an idea of how close I am to it. But, you know, I won't read the whole article, but he made these connections to the city. I mean, Lutz was a somewhat frequent name within the society pages for positive reasons in St. Louis newspapers. At one point, he was the best man for another person's wedding, and then that's reported in the paper. And so this just goes to show again that he had built these relationships during his time here. This next article, I'm going to give you 2 pieces before I tell you the story of it. I apologize, this is kind of blurry. This is the best display that I can get on this format, but I have some pieces kind of blocked out on the next slide that are a little bit clearer. This was an article that was published in 1936. And so we're kind of going ahead in time, and then we'll bounce back. As I've mentioned already, after Lutz leaves St. Louis, he receives a diplomatic appointment in Palestine. And so the St. Louis Star and Times in May of 1936 wrote a full-page article about this new appointment. And the headline is, "Holy Land Adventure, Former St. Louisians in a Biblical Setting." I won't read the whole thing, but it starts with, "Charles R. Lutz," he went by Karl, "transferred with bride from acting Swiss consul here to Palestine Post, finds life as it was in days of Christ, contrasting with modern radios, motor cars, and building booms." And that's kind of the theme of the article, just comparing his life in this, you know, so-called modern city in St. Louis to his appointment in Palestine. And there's some pictures of them there. There's a photo at the bottom, which is blown up here of them in front of the Damascus Gate. Obviously, it's a little blurry because it was published in 1936. But there's 2 pieces at the end of this article that I like to highlight. The first one, in one of the last few paragraphs, says, "Mr. Lutz has sent his St. Louis friends a few copies of the Palestine Post, an English daily published in Jerusalem." Now, this just goes to show he continued to maintain these connections with the region after he left. The article also mentions a little bit earlier on that he and his wife really enjoyed, for the first couple of years that they were there, World Events Intercede in 1939, but they enjoyed being there. They spent Christmas in Bethlehem and Easter in Jerusalem. And there's this line at the end of the article that if you don't know Lutz's story, it might not mean much, but if you know what he ends up doing in Budapest next, or what you can guess he does, this line sounds like a bit of foreshadowing. It says, "It's a big move from the Mississippi to the Jordan. In the consular service, one never knows where he may be sent next," which I think is just an interesting transition to what he actually does do next, where he is sent next. But we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what he actually does in Palestine. It is important to remember, for context's sake, that the British are in charge here in Palestine at the time. And the dates I have on there, 1936 to 1942, he actually goes back to Switzerland about 1940 or 1941 for about a year, and then transfers to Budapest in 42. But he's in Palestine for a few years. Got to move my video feed so I actually can read my quotes here. One of the first things that happens while he's there is that in 1936, the Lutzes are standing on the roof of their apartment, and they look down and they see 4 Jewish men lynched in the streets. The next day, Lutz writes a letter to his brother in which he said, "As I swore to the victims as they suffered hits and stabs, that one day I would speak up for them." Now, there's a short-term and a long-term promise inherent in that statement. Now, the short-term is that he did send reports to the British government about violence he had seen against Jews while he was there in Palestine. The long-term promise, of course, we will get to when we talk about his next appointment. So 1939, the war breaks out with the German invasion of Poland in September. And about 2,500 Germans, mostly diplomats, found themselves kind of de facto prisoners of war. I mean, basically trapped within Palestine, which is under British control, which is now a warring nation. And so this happens a lot during wars. So when the United States enters the war against Japan in late 41 and early 42, there were a number of Americans stuck in Japan. And what happens in those situations is that the warring nations will go to a neutral nation and they will appoint someone to mediate the release of the people in the warring nation. And so in this case, in Palestine, as a neutral diplomat from Switzerland, Lutz receives that appointment. And apparently he works like 20-hour days, does really impressive work, is able to eventually negotiate the release of these 2,500 people. And what ends up happening is that he actually receives a lot of praise from his colleagues and his superiors, so much praise that it actually reaches the Führer's office in Berlin. They start to know of Lutz by name as this just competent, neutral diplomat who had done this work in Palestine. That will come back later, I promise. Another thing happens, though, right around the same time, is that there were also a number of German Jews who were in Palestine at the time who had very little interest in going back to Germany, many of whom actually had escaped Germany and had gone to Palestine. And so at this point, Lutz is introduced to protective papers, which were later called Schutzpasses or Schutzbrief. And what these papers did, they were produced and authorized by the British. They gave their holders exile in Palestine. And so Lutz gives out a number of these. It's tricky to research Lutz because there is so little research, but the numbers in terms of how many he gave out ranges from a few hundred to about 2,000. But those papers as well will come back here in a second. Got to move my camera again. So if you're looking at the slide here, this photo in the background is a photo of him with his staff behind him. He had a staff of about 20 when he was in Palestine, so he was in Budapest. He was transferred there in 1942. His staff members, all 20 of them, end up participating actually in the rescue effort. And so between 1942 and 1944, Lutz is able to negotiate the emigration of about 10,000 Jewish children and young people from Budapest to Palestine, in part because of his previous connection, but also because Switzerland represented Britain's interests in Palestine at that point. And so he was able to secure that immigration for about 10,000 people. But things change in 1944. So for context here, Hungary was actually allied with Nazi Germany pretty early on, as early as 1940, for a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest ones, of course, was that they wanted to get back territory that they had lost during the First World War and, felt like they needed to ally with the Nazis or the Soviet Union, and then they choose to ally with the Nazis. They pass 3 really anti-Semitic pieces of legislation during this time. Jewish men and boys are often forced to participate in labor battalions and are sent to labor camps. But comparatively speaking, things are different in Hungary. Now, it's not really a safe location necessarily for Jews, but Hungary ends up being, and Budapest specifically, ends up being the last place under Axis control or influence to implement the final solution. They do not implement it until 1944. And so while Polish Jews and German Jews and French Jews are wide scale being sent to camps in the early 1940s, that does not happen to Hungarian Jews until 1944. This, of course, changes in March. On March 19th, 1944, the Nazis choose to invade Hungary for, again, a lot of complicated reasons, but in part because the Soviet Union was getting quite close to the Hungarian border, and also because there were indications that Hungary was considering switching sides in the war. And so the Nazis invade. They actually do not have the manpower to fully occupy the nation, but what they end up doing is they forge an agreement with Miklos Horthy, who had been the regent of Hungary since 1920, allow him to stay in power as basically a puppet leader of the government, and then he agrees to start implementing all of the things, for the most part, that he had not implemented in the preceding years. And so pretty soon after, within March, in Budapest, I think the Budapest ghetto, not the international ghetto that we'll talk about, but the Nazi-run ghetto opens in March of 44. And by mid-May, about May 15th, 1944, the trains to Auschwitz are running at full capacity. And in the 6 weeks between mid-May and early July 1944, about 438,000 Hungarian Jews are sent to Auschwitz. 90% of them are killed upon arrival. And so Karl Lutz is seeing this happen, and very early on, after the Nazis invade, decides to do something about it. One of the first things he does is the Jewish Council for Palestine, which is a non-governmental Zionist organization, had staff in Budapest at the time, and he basically brings them under the Swiss umbrella, provides them with diplomatic protection, really forms this department called the Department of Emigration of the Swiss Legation. And it is through that department that a lot of these rescue efforts end up being operated. Now, Lutz's position at this time, he was at the rank of a vice consul, and he was the head of the section for foreign interests in Budapest. And so his job was to represent the interests of about 14 nations, including Great Britain, United States, and El Salvador, which will become important here in a second. Another thing that happens, again, very early on, is that Lutz is introduced to the Auschwitz protocols. So the Auschwitz protocols there was a series of them, but there's really one main paper, one main series of reports that was written by two young men who had escaped Auschwitz, and then described in very vivid detail what they had seen in this report. But unfortunately, they were having a tough time getting it disseminated. A lot of nations and newspapers even would not publish it. And so Lutz is one of the first people to get access to this. It was actually a violation of international law for him to send it back to Switzerland. He knew his own nation probably wouldn't do anything about it, but so what he ends up doing is he gives this a copy of the Auschwitz protocols. Now, the reason he had it was because the Jewish community in Budapest had gotten a copy of it, and he got it because of his connections there. But he gives a copy of the Auschwitz protocols to a passing Romanian diplomat who takes it to the Consulate General of El Salvador in Geneva, where a man by the name of George Mandel Mantello was stationed. Now, some of you might know that name. Mantello is also a rescuer. He disseminated Salvadorian papers throughout Europe. He ends up sending several hundred of them to Lutz later on, who Lutz disseminates to protect people in Budapest. But Mandel Mantello ends up disseminating the Auschwitz protocols through Jewish communities for about 1,000 different people, and that is from kind of a grassroots movement. It ends up being widely publicized from there. So Lutz is a key piece of that chain of revealing that information. So that's all. I mean, this is all very early on. We're still in about May of 1944. Perhaps most importantly, Lutz remembers that he still has these papers, or he knows that these papers that he had been introduced to in Palestine, these protective papers, these Schutzpasses, there are about 7,000 or 8,000 of them that were authorized by the British, that had already been printed, and he ends up getting access to them, gets physical copies. And what he realizes is, in mid-1944, no one is going to get to Palestine at this point, but anyone who held these papers under the guise that they were going to Palestine, that they had some sort of connection to Switzerland, maybe were a Swiss national, anyone who held these papers were then under Swiss diplomatic protection, and they were exempt from a lot of things, a lot of actions that the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators were enacting in Budapest. And so often people who held protective papers could not be put into ghettos, often did not have to wear Jewish stars, and perhaps most importantly, could not be put on trains and sent to Auschwitz. Now, this was kind of a semi-legal interpretation of this on Lutz's part, but part of the idea was, because the Red Army is getting very close, the Germans are digging their heels in at this point in the war, but it's becoming pretty clear that the war is not going their way. The hope is, on behalf of people like Lutz, is that they can if he can disseminate as many of these as possible, he'll be able to protect a large number of people for, until the Red Army arrives and liberates the city. And so there's a very complex system of negotiation that he does, but they're basically already authorized by the British. He's able to get provisional authorization from his colleagues in Switzerland who say, okay, yes, you can cover the 7,000 to 8,000. But he realizes that he needs to actually get German authorization for these papers, because if he doesn't, if the German authorities who are technically in charge in Hungary don't validate neutral protective passes, there's really no point in printing them at all. And so again, he negotiates a little bit, doesn't really know who to talk to. He's eventually told by Hitler's plenipotentiary in Hungary that, you need to talk to. You need to talk to this man who just arrived in Budapest by the name of Adolf Eichmann. So Lutz sets up a meeting with Eichmann. Remember how I described Lutz's personality when he was in college? All of this ties together, I promise. He was someone who was very accomplished, well-spoken, very well-dressed, but he could be soft-spoken, did not call attention to himself. For all of these reasons, he ends up not really intimidating Eichmann, and Eichmann ends up underestimating him. And so Lutz goes into this meeting, and Eichmann uses it as an opportunity to mock him. He said, "Who do you think you are? Are you Moses taking your people to the promised land?" But Lutz is adamant. He said, these are already approved. These are valid under international law. Spoiler alert, they were not. And I'll explain that later. But he's pretty adamant that these papers should be authorized. And Eichmann does, kind of leaves him with a half answer. Lutz thinks it was, all of his negotiation was for naught. But Eichmann does pass up the request to Himmler, and then Himmler ends up passing it up to the Führer's office. Now, I am unsure if Hitler himself actually saw it, but a little while later, Lutz gets a message back from someone in the Führer's office. What they end up doing, they do for a lot of reasons, but this message basically said, we remember this man. We remember this man from his work in Palestine. And because of that, we are granting authorization for these 8,000 papers. Now, again, there were multiple reasons why they decided to do that, but part of it was because they remembered Lutz's work negotiating the release of those 2,500 people. Now, I'm going to kind of pause a beat and go on a little bit of a tangent here, but I'm guessing at least some of you on this call who are familiar with this area of history are wondering, where does Raoul Wallenberg fit into this? So Wallenberg, for those of you who don't know, was he posed as a Swedish diplomat. He was not actually trained as a diplomat, but he was sent in 1944 by Sweden to enact rescue efforts. He was actually funded by the U.S. War Refugee Board. And so he arrives in July 1944. And one of the first meetings he sets up is actually with Karl Lutz. And Karl Lutz is the person who shows him how he had been producing these protective papers, which I will tell you the details of here in a second. But then Wallenberg goes and does the same thing himself, starts producing Swedish protective papers at a lower level, but Wallenberg does end up being more well-known than Lutz for reasons that I am happy to discuss in Q&A if anyone is curious. It's kind of a long story, but there is a bit of overlap between some of the neutral rescue efforts in Budapest at this time, because there are a few different nations and entities participating in this. Now the Swiss operation is much larger and much more complex than the other rescue efforts. And at one point, Lutz and his colleagues do attempt to basically bring the other rescue efforts underneath the Swiss umbrella, and are partially successful when they're doing that. So let's talk about these papers specifically. If you're looking at Zoom, you'll see a picture on the right, and then one of the protective papers, or at least part of one, on the left there. And so Lutz sends out the word that he has these papers, and literally hundreds of Hungarian Jews start lining up outside of his office. He was working out of the American embassy, and so there's hundreds of people lining up in Freedom Square hoping to get one of these papers. And one of the things that I neglected to mention, and probably should have, is that when Lutz returned to his office, he never intended on only saving 8,000 people. He actually immediately alters the papers so that each one of them covered not an individual, but a family. And so the number of people he's able to protect goes up to 30, 40, 50,000 almost immediately. He was actually intentionally vague when he made the request to Eichmann. He said, I want coverage for 8,000 units, not 8,000 people, not 8,000 individuals, 8,000 units. And so he interprets that as meaning families. And these papers, which have the Swiss seal on them, Lutz signed them, again, semi-kind of legal, or at least had the appearance of legality. But he and the volunteers producing these make sure to never number them above 8,000. Once they get to 8,000 papers, they just start all over again at number 1, because they knew if there was a 14,000 flying out there, anyone who saw it would know that it was a forgery. And so eventually, because of the volume of people wanting these papers, he moves his operation to an old glass showroom of a glass factory, which is now called the Glass House. It is now a museum to Karl Lutz. And at one point, by the end of 1944, there are 800 people in that building. Either some of them were producing the papers, a lot of them were just being protected and just needed somewhere to go. And so this is a massive operation that's happening outside within this building. There's also a lot of forgeries, forgeries of protective papers flying around. Now, Lutz knows that there are forgeries and looks the other way. We know that he knows because at one point he actually gave Swiss letterhead to people producing the forgeries, and they go on and produce them themselves, often within the Glass House. And so at this point, there's all these protective papers flying around Budapest. And, so Karl Lutz, so there's a page on historychannel.com, which was a pretty fair depiction of Lutz, but it describes him as defying the Nazis through paperwork, which is technically true. Lutz was basically a government bureaucrat who probably could have looked the other way, but chose not to. However, that belies the complexity of his actual rescue effort, because he does more than just produce paperwork and often steps in to rescue individual people. So I've mentioned the international ghetto already. I will actually describe what that is. So there were 2 ghettos in Budapest at the time. There was the big ghetto, which was the Nazi-run ghetto, which held about 60,000 people. And then there was what was called the international ghetto. Now this was a set of buildings, apartment buildings and neighborhoods that were put under the diplomatic protection of several different nations and entities. There were about 122 buildings total. 76 of them were under Swiss protection. 33 of them were under Swedish protection. And the remaining number were under protection of the Vatican, Portugal, Spain, and the Red Cross gets involved as well. And Red Cross are actually very active in Budapest at this time. And so this was a place where Hungarian Jews, primarily those in Budapest who had lost their property, lost their homes, had somewhere to go and had somewhere to live. Karl Lutz's wife, Trudy, if I haven't mentioned this already, is an active part of this rescue effort. She's very active in that community, bringing in supplies and food and everything that she can. But there's also many cases where both Lutz and his wife step in to rescue individual Jews. So his wife is actually pretty well known for bribing soldiers with chocolate and candy in order for them to maybe look the other way or to validate some papers that were perhaps not legitimate. Late in the fall of 1944, mid-fall or so, the Lutzes actually follow death marches and start giving out paperwork to people and pulling them out of line in order to rescue them. There's also another, and I say famous, I mean famous within this very niche area of research, a famous story about Karl Lutz on the banks of the Danube. Now, for context here, Miklos Horthy is in charge for part of the year. He actually halted the deportations in July of 1944, in part because of the publication of the Auschwitz protocols, but also because he was getting major pressure from world leaders and neutral nations, world leaders including the Pope, including Roosevelt, and the King of Sweden as well. And it was a bit of a political decision. He ends up stopping the deportations for a few months. Now, the Arrow Cross, the violently fascist political party in Hungary, stages a coup in October of '44, overthrows Horthy, and takes over the administration of the nation. And they enact some of the most horrifying episodes of violence against Jews during this era of the Holocaust. And so this day, while Lutz was in his car with his driver, this is a photo of his driver here in this photo, of him and his driver, They were driving past the banks of the Danube one day within Budapest, and one of the things that the Arrow Cross would do is they would bring groups of Jews down to the banks of the river, and they would stage mass executions. They would kill large numbers of people and then push them in the river. And as Lutz and his driver were driving past one day, one of these had just happened. They just missed it. But he looks in the water, Lutz looks in the water, and he sees this woman bobbing up and down, clearly having trouble staying above water. She had been shot within that incident, but had been shot in such a place, and because the water was so cold, in basically winter at this point, the blood flow actually was slowed, and she was still alive. And so Karl Lutz, in his full suit, I mean, very likely wearing something very similar to what he's wearing here, jumps into the freezing cold water of the Danube, pulls this woman out, turns around to these Arrow Cross soldiers with firearms and starts just berating them. Says, how dare you do this? This woman is under Swiss protection. You have no right to do this. And these soldiers had no idea who this guy was, but maybe he is some important official. So they kind of throw up their hands and say, okay, take her with you. And so he puts her in the car, brings her back to the international ghetto, connects her with a Jewish surgeon who ends up saving her life. Now, you hadn't figured this out already, Karl Lutz had, so far as we know, never met that woman before. She was not someone that he had protected or who actually had a paper, but he saw an opportunity to save an individual person, and he chose to do it. And so, unfortunately, in late 1944, when the Arrow Cross takes over, one of their first proclamations is actually, they say, okay, we're not authorizing any more of these neutral protective papers of any nation, in part because by that point they knew that a lot of forgeries were circulating throughout the city. But they actually never end up enforcing that, in part because they wanted the new regime to be recognized by those neutral nations. And so, again, lots of negotiations going on behind the scenes. I have a document on the next slide that should give you an idea of those. But they do end up deciding, the Germans and their Hungarian collaborators end up deciding to continue to honor that limited number in the case of the Swiss of about 7,000 or 8,000, and then smaller numbers of other nations. But because there were so many forgeries circulating throughout Budapest, first Eichmann brings Lutz into his office and says, accuses him of lying to him, which was not completely untrue, but Lutz pleads ignorance. He said, yeah, I thought you meant families when I said units. Clearly there was a miscommunication here. But Eichmann and again, his collaborators and colleagues, what they end up doing, because they're still authorizing, remember, these 7,000 or 8,000, which is really tens of thousands, they end up pulling Karl and Trudy Lutz out of their bed in the middle of the night. And this happens more than once. And they bring them down to a brickyard, which had basically been serving as a transit camp for Jews before they were put on a train and sent to Auschwitz. And there was a group of Jews there who were holding Swiss protective papers, claiming to be under Swiss protection. Now, some of them were the semi-legitimate papers that had been signed by Lutz. Some were kind of forgeries and some were very obvious forgeries. And so, likely at gunpoint, the Lutzes are forced to go through each individual paper and to identify the forgeries. And they try to let the more convincing forgeries through, but they knew that if they just let all of the papers through, including ones that were handwritten and very obviously not real, then none of the papers would be authorized. And so in order to maintain the authority of the remainder of the papers, they choose to do this. And anyone who did not have a paper that could be validated by the Lutzes was no longer exempt from being put into a ghetto, being sent to a camp. And this action ends up haunting the Lutzes for the rest of their lives. Now, I need to move my camera here again. I'll kind of summarize what's happening in this document here. So I found this like 2 weeks ago, and I was very excited to share this. So this is a document that's actually, the US State Department has a copy of it because it mentions Wallenberg later on. But what I have here is a note from the German legation in Hungary to the Swiss legation. So this is something Lutz would have eventually seen. It was sent in December of 1944. Lutz didn't get a copy of it until at least a month later. The siege of Budapest starts on December 24th, 1944. And so, of course, it takes some time for things to move in situations like that. The reason why I include this, and I will explain it after I read part of this, is this goes to confirm and show some things that I've already said, that these negotiations are happening behind the scenes, but it also reveals a little bit about the nature of some of these rescue efforts. The one thing that you need to know before I start reading this is that when it uses the term foreign nationality in this document, that means that, so people who had, say, Swiss protective papers were holding them under the guise that they actually had some connection to Switzerland. They were basically foreign nationals. And so that's what they're talking about here. So this is the note from the German legation. It said, however, the possession of foreign nationality by Jews residing in Hungary was only recognized in principle in the way described above if it could be proved that the Jews concerned legally possessed this nationality prior to March 19th, 1944, the date the Nazis invaded. The acquisition of a foreign nationality by Hungarian Jews after that date could not be considered as valid because it was obviously contrary to international law and only resulted in abuse. Since a number of foreign representatives in Hungary continued in spite of the foregoing, partly and at times without any valid ground, to issue provisional documents to Hungarian Jews and to protect them, these representatives soon intervened with the, quote, competent Hungarian and German authorities. It goes on. So what this is saying is two things. First, anyone who held these papers was holding them under the guise that they had some connection to Switzerland before March. None of them did. And so these were very shakily legal from the beginning. It also goes to show, in that part at the end when it said, you know, since all these representatives were continuing in spite of these earlier agreements, it goes to show that people like Lutz were not just producing these papers simply because they had the ability to. They were doing it in part because they didn't, and were continuing to produce literally tens of thousands of papers in complete violation of what the Nazis were telling them, but in Lutz's case, in the hope that he could just save as many people as possible. Gotta move my camera again. Okay, so as I mentioned, the siege of Budapest starts December 24th, 1944, and Budapest is not liberated until February of 1945. And so around that time in December, Lutz turns over his rescue efforts to a couple Swiss nationals who end up giving paperwork out for at least a couple weeks throughout the siege. So he was required, actually, he took refuge with all of his staff and his wife in the basement of the British embassy, which he was required to protect because of his position, because he was representing British interests. And so they, you know, are stuck inside or are quarantined. This is a very different situation, but I think some of us are kind of getting the idea of what this might feel like. They're stuck in this basement for 2 months. And with very little food, close quarters, of course, they couldn't even go out. The war was raging around them. But eventually the Red Army does liberate the city in February of 1945. They're able to emerge. The Red Army and the Soviet Union expel neutral diplomats. Wallenberg, unfortunately, gets arrested by Soviet soldiers. And you know, there's a lot of mystery as to what happened to him, but he was likely killed shortly after by Soviet soldiers or died in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. There were additional details that came out after the wall fell in 1989. But the Lutzes do get out and make it first to Turkey. And the next day in their hotel in Istanbul, this sounds like a small thing, but it will become important here in a second, Karl Lutz orders a glass of orange juice for breakfast. And remember, he'd been in a basement for 2 months, probably hadn't had any fruit or any sort of, you know, proper sustenance. And so a glass of orange juice was a big deal at this point. And so he has that glass of orange juice. Eventually they take multiple modes of transportation, are making their way back to the border of Switzerland, he and his wife and his staff as well. And on the way back, Karl Lutz, who hated public speaking, writes this short set of remarks, this short speech, just describing what he had done and just detailing what he had done and why he had done it, because he expected that there would be someone waiting for him at the border of Switzerland, that at the very least, his colleagues would be there to ask him to butcher a quote out of context, what did you do during the war? Or to maybe celebrate something that he had done. So this group gets to the border of Switzerland, and the only thing any government official asks him is, do you have something to declare? Because it was a customs agent. It was a customs agent who asked that same question to everyone who arrived at the border, because there was no one waiting for him. In fact, no one in Switzerland wants to hear about anything he did for quite a bit of time, at least a few weeks, if not a few months, after he returns. In fact, the only acknowledgement he gets from any colleague of his about anything he did in the war years was a note on his expense report. The finance department wrote this note on the report saying, "You are not authorized to buy this glass of orange juice in Istanbul." And then we're complaining about it. But eventually, Switzerland ends up condemning Lutz for what he did. He was told that he went outside of his authority and was unauthorized to produce extra protective papers and to rescue the number of people that he did. Switzerland basically buries this story for 50 years. They do not acknowledge his rescue efforts on a national level in an official capacity until 1995, 20 years after Lutz died. Now, Lutz does get some acclaim from outside of Switzerland. He is nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize 3 times in the 1960s, never winning. He's declared righteous among the nations in the 1960s. His wife receives the same honor in the 1970s. His hometown does declare him an honorary citizen. That's about as close as he gets to some sort of local recognition, but it was a very small town, a very small group of people. And he's very well beloved in Israel and gets some acknowledgement elsewhere in Europe. But for the most part, his reputation is crushed in Switzerland. And he actually spends the rest of his life trying to build it back up. Because at this point, he was just seen as this troublemaker who had violated the rules, who had not followed orders, so to speak. And so he spends the rest of his life trying to rebuild that. And I usually end here, but I have one more thing to point out after I do this. So shortly after Lutz got back, while he was still kind of struggling to get some sort of acknowledgement for what he did, he wrote this short report, which is about 11 pages long. And in it, he wrote, now in Lutz's case, his faith was something that really tied into his rescue efforts. We know rescuers were motivated by a range of things. In his case, his Christianity was a big part of it. So he writes in this report that he did not consider himself a Christian in name only, that he felt it was a, quote, matter of conscience to save people condemned to die, meaning the Hungarian Jews in Budapest that he felt obliged to protect. And because of that, many historians conclude that Karl Lutz organized and oversaw the largest civilian rescue mission of the entire Holocaust. The U.S. Holocaust Museum estimates that he rescued 62,000 people throughout the extent of this operation. Unfortunately, there still is not too much research on him. Wallenberg is very deserving of being well known for his rescue efforts, but he's much more known than Lutz. Lutz deserves to be at least as well known as people like Wallenberg and of course Schindler and other rescuers. But there have been a few things published on Lutz if you're interested in learning more. Obviously, I will answer questions. I know I've been talking for a while. But there was a biography that was published in 1995, translated into English in 2000, called Dangerous Diplomacy, the story of Karl Lutz, rescuer of 62,000 Hungarian Jews. It is out of print. There's actually only one copy of this book in a St. Louis library, and I happen to have it right now. After all these quarantine ends, I will return it and someone else can read it. But you can get used copies online. There's 2 other things that are probably more accessible. I'll skip to the bottom and I'll kind of move back up. In 2018, Karl Lutz's stepdaughter co-edited this book. Her name is Agnes Hershey. She co-edited a book called Under Swiss Protection, Jewish Eyewitness Accounts from Wartime Budapest. And to the book, there's about 24 stories. Most of the book are just individual vignettes and stories from people rescued by Lutz, people who were part of the rescue effort, and people who were witness to it. So it's a really valuable source. And then the final one, I leave this one at the end because as of today, there's a Karl Lutz video book and documentary that was produced, I believe, in 2014. And as of today, because it is Karl Lutz's 125th birthday, that video book, and so the video book is basically, I've got it on my iPad somewhere, but it's kind of a flip book with videos and pictures of Lutz and of survivors rescued by him. That is now available online. You can actually access that at karllutz.videobooks.com. I will send this all out if anyone wants a copy of it. Until then, the only way to access both the documentary, which is also worth watching, and the video book is to actually download the Karl Lutz app. either from the App Store or the Google Play Store, and those are you can only access those via tablet. And I have it on my iPad, like I said, somewhere. So those are all worth looking at. And this is the last thing I'll say. I'm also always happy to talk about this if you cannot tell and answer questions. My email is on this slide. Those of you who are maybe just listening, it's amyglutz4@gmail.com. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, everyone.
This is Nancy.
Easy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Have you been able to trace how you are related? Are you absolutely sure that there is sort of a direct familial connection there?
I'm not. That's, I usually include that at the beginning, but I forgot to. The reason why I was interested was because we had the same last name. My family is mostly from Germany. I do have a Swiss branch on my dad's side, and I need to trace that one a little bit further back. But, I suspected early on because, we were from similar geographic areas, different nations with similar geographic areas. And when my dad first saw the photo, he said something like, oh, my dad he's probably listening to this, he's going to correct me, but he said something like, that looks just like my dad, or just looks like my uncle. And so it was kind of a rumor for a while, but I actually did look into it. I did some genealogy, and I have not been able to find a connection. And so if there is a connection, it's through that Swiss branch of my family, and it would be several generations back.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Amy. This is Evelyn. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Oh, great. Or see me, whatever. I was curious, do you know what happened to most of the people that he rescued? Where did they end up?
Oh my gosh, everywhere.
Oh.
So actually, if you watch the documentary, and there's a trailer of it I could send you all. The documentary itself is actually in multiple different languages because most of the documentary are interviews with people he rescued who all went to different places. And so there were some who came to the United States. I think there were a few who ended up staying in Hungary. Some actually ended up elsewhere in Europe. So it was everywhere.
Amy, I have two, okay, I have two questions. First of all, I wanted to know, did he ever become a dual citizen? Did he become a United States citizen? That's one question. And secondly, did he ever get any assistance from the American War Refugee Board?
That's a great question. So far as I know, he did not receive dual citizenship. There was something a couple years ago where George Washington University gave him some sort of honorary acknowledgement, but he did not have dual citizenship. Well, actually, I take that back. He might have. He was a permanent resident here, but I haven't found any evidence that he was a dual citizen. And I've actually looked pretty deeply into some of the papers. So I'll continue to pursue that, and I'll let you know if I find something different. The other piece, no, he did not. I mean, maybe tangentially through Wallenberg, but he did not receive any direct assistance from the U.S. War Refugee Board. His rescue effort differed from Wallenberg's in many different ways, but in part because Wallenberg was sent to rescue. He was sent with the funds and with the directive to rescue. Lutz was sent there as just a normal diplomat, and rescue was not supposed to be part of the operation, but it was. And so for those reasons, he didn't actually receive any support from us.
Did they have any children? Is there any legacy still alive?
Yeah. So I didn't mention this, but Carl and Trudy Lutz actually get divorced shortly after the war. By all accounts, I mean, it was, I hate to use the word amicable, but it was as amicable as a separation could be. She actually spends the rest of her life traveling the world telling his story. So and her story, but after he dies in 1975, she spends the next 20 years being the primary person telling this story. He gets remarried shortly after. He actually marries a Hungarian Jewish woman who he had protected in Budapest, who has a daughter named Agnes Hershey, who co-edited that book. And so he did not have any biological children. There were a lot of children in his family, and so he had lots of nieces and nephews, and there's a branch of the Lutz family directly connected to him in New York, I think. But no, so he just has his stepdaughter. She is still alive. She's in Switzerland. I've actually talked to her before, but no biological children that we're aware of.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Hi. I just wanted to mention that we have had conversations with her, or with the Lutz Institute, about bringing Agnes to St. Louis, which would be very, very appropriate. And hopefully we'll get back to those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, things are kind of stalled, but I did, like I said, I talked to them this morning. They were very excited to share all the anniversary stuff with me. So I'll forward that to you, Dan.
The story of pulling the woman from the water, was that from that eyewitness collection? I mean, who could have seen it? And
His driver was there, as was, of course, the woman that he rescued. And so that's where the testimony would have come from.
Amy,
Yes.
the most interesting part for me in all of this is I don't know how he would have been able to do all of this had he not had the German connections in Palestine. So they basically had connections on both sides of this process. And I don't think many people would have been able to do that in the same way.
Yeah, he was in a very unique position because of his life. And the reason why I tell his whole story is not just because of his connections to St. Louis, but because one of the beauties about history is when you look at things through hindsight, sometimes you see how people just kind of are in the right place at the right time. And so in Lutz's case, remember, he was sending all these letters when he was in the United States begging to come home and was always told no. You know, maybe had one of those letters, gotten an affirmative response, he maybe never would have been in Palestine. He maybe would have been back in Switzerland. And so it's really interesting to see how all of the pieces of his life connect. But yeah, that connection with Palestine is very necessary to what he did later.
That's right. And the reason that I've been looking at that is that I'm getting very deeply into the history of Golda Meir. And in much the same way, she was involved in all these things way before all this, and it all seems to really build this larger story of the Holocaust.
Oh yeah, and Lutz's rescue efforts, I mean, he technically saved a couple hundred or a couple thousand people in Palestine. He saved Jewish children between 1942 and 1944. It's a years-long operation, for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just a point of interest, you know, you mentioned that you were talking about his rescue of that woman at the banks of the Danube. There is a Holocaust memorial where the arrow cross, I don't know if you've ever been to Budapest, but
I've not, but I've seen pictures.
Okay, well, on the banks of the Danube, for those of you who may not know, there's a Holocaust memorial, and it consists of shoes that are like embedded in the cobblestones there, you know, they're metal or they're stone, whatever they are, and that commemorates that, and that's a very poignant story. And I'm kind of surprised that when you go there with a guide, that story's not mentioned. It would enhance it, you know.
Yeah. I was there too, and they have every kind of shoe. They have a high heel, they have a baby shoe. They are, you know, they really wanted to depict that. But also what we learned on our tour, not about Karl Lutz, like you said, but that they used to tie two Jews together so that they would only have to use one bullet.
One bullet.
Yeah, I mean, it was a horrific place, and it's definitely a very emotional memorial. So.
Yeah, I didn't mention this in my speech, in part because I'm trying to like limit some of the more morbid details, but which maybe I shouldn't. But the Arrow Cross there's about more than 60,000 people are considered to have been murdered by the Arrow Cross during their short reign. They were just massively killing and oppressing a lot of people, especially in those incidents on the banks of the Danube. Any other questions?
Thank you for
Thank you, Amy.
Yes.
Of course.
Thank you.
That was an incredible presentation, and
Thank you.
again, it was recorded, so those that couldn't hear it now will have the opportunity. We hope we'll go on and present more of these. And let me finally wish everyone health and safety, especially in the time of our spring holidays coming up, which I think everyone might be celebrating in unique ways this year. But let them be happy, healthy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
This was the highlight of my day.
It's my highlight to see other people, so
Oh, good to
I'm
see all
glad
your,
you're
yes. Okay,
Thanks,
we'll
everybody.
stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.